Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, and may God's peace be upon all of His prophets, starting with the father of the ideology of the oneness of God, Prophet Abraham, and going through all of his prophets from the time of Abraham and the descendants of Abraham, including Prophets Moses, Prophet Jesus, and the last of all prophets, Muhammad. May God's peace and prayers be upon them all. On behalf of the shareholders of American Finance House La Riba, the management, the staff, and on behalf of the Muslim community in the United States and Canada, I'd like to welcome all of you here this morning. And I really appreciate you braving the early hours when we start, and we thank you very much for coming. And also those who live in Los Angeles, congratulations on the Lakers. And would like to also congratulate every father here this morning for Father's Day. I'm sure tomorrow your wife and children will be taking you out, having a nice Father's Day breakfast or lunch, and I hope you will have some nice gifts tomorrow. The idea of American Finance House La Riba started 14 years ago, and we started with humble means, but we did one thing that's very, very significant, and that was relying on the resources of the community, relying on the successes of many members of the community. And our motto was very simple. If you really believe in what you say, you put your money where your mouth is. And that's what many of the Muslim community members have done for the last 14 years. We're very, very thankful to Almighty God for guiding us on the righteous path, for giving us people like you, and for giving us the thoughts of serving the community to make a difference in the community, regardless of the skin color, ethnicity, language, religious background, because we're all from God, and indeed we will end up going back to Almighty God. Just a little note on the program. To my knowledge, I consider myself very fortunate to be honored with the presence of many distinguished guest speakers from all over the world and guests from all over the world. I know that if I mention countries, I will forget one, as always the case. So I would like to thank you all for coming from faraway places. I just want to go through these flags that you see. And these flags represent the awardees, the people, the brothers and sisters who made a difference in Islamic banking in the world over the last 25 years. First flag is a flag of India, honoring the first awardee, and that is our dear teacher and professor and leader, Professor Najatullah Siddiqui, sitting to my left here. We're very honored to have him with us also today. Second flag is a flag of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and it was given, actually it represents two of the awardees. Sheikh Saleh Kamel, one of the pioneers in Islamic banking since 27 years ago, and nothing less than the one who really brought Islamic banking to the 21st century, my dear brother, Dr. Saleh Malaika, the chairman of the next session. And then the Malaysian flag. And the Malaysian flag honors our dear brother, please stand up, Nur Muhammad Yaqub. He is the brain behind the recovery of Malaysia against all odds, devising some unique ways to recover Malaysia. These ways are being taught now at Harvard, at Yale, at MIT as case studies for the different approach of government thinkers on how to solve a problem that was not solved by the IMF. As a matter of fact, the chairman of the IMF, the new chairman of the IMF, has acknowledged what Malaysia has done, and you are sitting this morning with the real brain behind many of these ideas and policies. Next to this flag is a flag of Turkey, and we're very honored also today to have with us, and it was a surprise for me personally, and that's why we apologize that you're not on the program. His Excellency Professor Sabahattin Zaim, please stand up, Professor Sabahattin Zaim, also an awardee of La Riba Award. Professor Sabahattin Zaim, he and Professor Ahmed Najjar may God bless his soul, were the pioneers of Islamic banking, and they met with King Faisal, may God's peace be upon his soul, inshallah, rahimahullah, and they started the Islamic Development Bank idea. Professor Sabahattin Zaim comes from Turkey, and Turkey is not a small country. I don't know if you know this or not, but the second largest military establishment after the United States in NATO is Turkey. So it is not a small country, it is an important country for everybody, including us, inshallah. Then the next flag is the flag of Pakistan. And Professor Khurshid Ahmad, one of the designers of Islamic banking in Pakistan and promoter of the ideas, and it's catching on, I understand, in June, end of June next week, Pakistan is going to make some final decisions regarding Islamic banking there. Unfortunately, he's not with us. The next flag is from England, and actually it represents a man from England. I don't know what your passport says, Iqbal, but Mr. Iqbal Khan, please stand up. Brother Iqbal Khan is another pioneer in Islamic banking, and he's now trying to implement Islamic banking through the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, through a subsidiary called Amana Investments, and they are offering different products from New York, and he is moving, already moved to Dubai. I talked to your wife, and I don't know about this move, but she's excited anyway. And then the next flag is the flag of the United States, representing Mahmoud El-Gamal. Where is Mahmoud? Who is being honored today. Mahmoud is sitting out there. And the last flag, but not the least, honoring the Canadian brother from Canada, Brother Parvez Nassim, a hard-working servant of the community in Canada over the last 25 plus years. We thank you all for coming, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we have come here in love, to learn, to grasp, to communicate, to exchange ideas in a humble and very deliberate way, so we can come back, inshallah, to our homes better because we learned something more. Thank you all for coming. May God bless you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to introduce the chairman of the next session. He's Dr. Saleh Malaika. I also call him Professor Saleh Malaika. Dr. Saleh used to teach at the University of Petroleum and Minerals in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. And for the last, how many years, Dr. Saleh?
10 years.
For the last 10 years, he brought the two important investment funds in Al-Barakah called Al-Tawfiq and Al-Amin to the 21st centuries under his guidance and leadership, and the leadership of Nasiruddin Khan, another speaker. They have brought in some very, very nice products that would serve the community. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Saleh Malaika. Assalamu alaikum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الأمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good morning to you all. On behalf of American Finance House and La Riba, I'd like to welcome you all this morning. This is the 8th annual international conference that La Riba Islamic Banking and Finance is holding, and from one year to another it keeps getting better. American Finance House La Riba has started with a humble beginning in 1987 and has achieved tremendous success, not only in profitability, but recently we heard about their introduction of home finance, which was sold to Freddie Mac. And I think that was a very big achievement since it's opening the door for Islamic home finance in the United States in a big way, inshallah. We have a keynote speaker, Professor Najatullah Siddiqui, and then 3 other speakers this morning. For the sake of time, we're already late in our beginning. We're going to limit each speaker to 15 minutes. Professor Najatullah Siddiqui, which was introduced already by Dr. Yahya Abdurrahman, is very well known. He's a professor of economics at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And he's done tremendous work in promoting Islamic banking and finance His research is very well known, books written on Islamic economics. And with that, please join me to welcome Professor Najatullah Siddiqui.
Assalamu alaikum. Before I say a few words, I remember, I think it was 1989, I first knew Dr. Yahya Abdur Rahman, and I was a little surprised after the very first meeting how he is putting so much trust in me to honor me as the first awardee, as he said, and other things. But later on, I had occasions to meet him and observe his moving around, and then I discovered the secret that he's a man who trusts you, and therefore you trust him. And that is how he has gathered around him, mashallah, very eminent people, people with brains, people with legs to walk around and do his biddings. I'm thankful to him to give me this occasion. You know, as he said, it's about quarter century or more that modern Islamic banking and finance has been around, and it has moved around along two parallel streams. One, let us call it official, Pakistan, Iran, Sudan, Malaysia, Indonesia, so many countries are doing it on the government level. The other is in the private sector. For reasons which you will not miss, I will focus on the private sector. Why? One should give more importance to states, governments, big names. There are a couple of reasons. First, very elementary but significant reason is that it is in the private sector that most of the money is. It is individuals, companies, corporations who own the money which you want to attract and move around. So no wonder one should pay more attention to individuals, institutions, corporations, and the private sector. The second, no less important reason is that individuals are the people with conscience, Zamir. You see, I mention this because Islamic finance, Islamic banking has two pillars on which to get a solid standing. One is, of course, efficiency. If these institutions don't make profit for you, don't give you home finance at competitive rates, you won't be becoming their customers. But there is the other important reason that they do the things which satisfy your conscience, which is according to teachings in which you believe, according to values to which you subscribe. So that is no less important a reason. And for this reason, I think we should pay more attention to people with conscience rather than to governments. I do not say they have no values, they have no ideals, they have no conscience, but you know, there is a difference between an individual with a conscience and with a realization that he has to face his Lord one day, and a big institutions, a cabinet and president and advisors, so the conscience gets diluted or diffused. The third reason on my advice for focusing on private sector is that at the present our size is very limited. The volume of money which we are handling or which the individual Islamic financial institutions are able to mobilize is not big enough to meet the need of governments. Governments in developing countries, for example, are in need of financing their infrastructure, telecommunications, road system, transport. We don't have that much money. We have some modest amount of money which may be better in the service of individual, for example, needing to buy a house, home. People going into medical practice needing some equipment, X-ray machines, MRI machines, other things. Individuals needing a car, and so on. So that is another practical reason that we should pay more attention. And it so happens that most of our recently developed products, our Ijara and Salam and Istisna, they are also at the present tailored to meet modest needs, not very big needs which run into hundreds of millions in terms of finance. Lastly, I think, as compared to governments, private sector and individuals, institutions, they are more flexible, they are more innovative, they are quicker to adjust to the changing industrial and financial environment around us. And these are days of monumental change. If you stick to the old ways of doing things, you get sidelined. So this is the last but not the least reason. And I think if you go back a little to history, it has been the individual, the private sector, which has been in the vanguard of Islamic financial institutions since the middle of the 20th century. As a matter of fact, involvement of the state has been a mixed blessing. Nation-states tend to use everything, including religion in general and Islamic finance in particular, as instruments of national policy for promoting their strategic interests and hidden agendas. In case of authoritarian regimes, Islamic finance has often been used as a tool for consolidation of authority and for ensuring political legitimacy. Priorities dictated by economics have sometimes been forsaken in favor of those dictated by political expediency. This happened in Pakistan in the late 70s when Islamization of the liability side was done first, while the asset side of the commercial banks was yet to change. Sudan was no different, as sweeping legislations were introduced in early 80s without doing the necessary homework for preparing the ground properly. So it is interesting to note that in the early periods of Islamic history, finance was largely left to the individual. The state exercised hisba, that is regulatory functions, to ensure fair dealings, preventing fraud and deception, and monitoring weights and measures and other standards. But it did not take over the positive function of managing the community's savings and investment. One of the lessons of recent history has been that governments tend to over-regulate. There are reasons to believe that a modern Islamic state will be overzealous to regulate. It may even overstep from regulation to full-scale management of the financial sector. One can already discern such a tendency in Sudan, Pakistan, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. But neither the law of Islam nor the maqasid al-Sharia or the masalih involved require such a policy or even condone it. Such policies can only lead to disastrous results, as the history of the socialist states have shown. Moreover, collective management does not and cannot have the flexibility and innovativeness that Islamic finance requires in a fast-changing world. The moral, especially for the Islamic financial movement in the West in general and in the United States of America in particular, is that we should focus on the private sector, on individuals at the grassroots. For them especially, not much good will come out of focusing on Muslim countries, coaxing them to adopt Islamic finance, or divert some of their resources toward it by simply issuing a government decree. As you know, Islamic financial movement before 1975 grew on the basis of dedicated efforts of individual initiatives at the grassroots. The three notable developments of interest-free savings and loan societies in Indian subcontinent, which has been documented by Dr. Muhammad Habibullah, that dates back to 40s. The city of Mir Ghamr experiment in Egypt, pioneered and documented by late Ahmadinejad Rahimahullah, and the Tabung Haji in Malaysia, which won Islamic Development Bank Award for its innovative role. All these date back, both of them date back to 1960s. Now, all of this came about through individual efforts. Even the Dubai Islamic Bank, established in 75, Darul Mal Islami, Al Baraka, all these are based on individual initiatives. These were, of course, parallel to these. There was the Islamic Development Bank, established in 1975, and then we have the government initiatives, 1979 Iran, 1979 Pakistan, 83 Iran, 84 Sudan. Now, a great blessing had this government initiative, official patronage. Later on, Pakistan, Iran, and Sudan were followed by Malaysia and Indonesia. It has been a great blessing indeed. I am not the one to belittle it. And I think we should thank Allah that they were there. It is because of the government adoption of Islamic finance that it came on the world scene. It became something visible, something which you cannot ignore, neither the IMF nor the other big players in the world of finance. But unfortunately, most of these official initiatives lacked a solid basis in a democratic polity. The beauty of democratic decision-making is that it is not hypocritical. Islamization of banking in the framework of democratic governance would have had the benefit of wide-scale participation of those involved: bankers, businessmen, accountants, auditors, and the common man, male and female, as depositors or borrowers. The fact that they had a say in decisions to begin with, and in the decision how to proceed, where to compromise, where to stay firm, etc., would have gone a long way in assuring compliance. Decisions taken in this manner and open to revision through dialogue and debate in the light of experience would have been implemented at least as seriously and as sincerely as the other laws of the land concerned. But what we actually had was entirely different, and the results are there for all to see. Those gathered here today can hardly affect the policies of the rulers. Let us hope and pray that they correct, but we think that we can gainfully focus on those within our reach, the individuals everywhere, savers, investors, bankers. And it is heartening to note that a number of indigenous Islamic financial institutions have emerged in North America over the last decade or so. Though very small, their strength lies in being community-based. Meanwhile, the entry of conventional players into the field and rapid growth of mutual funds have provided a new source of energy. And I think they will grow. I wish and pray that they grow. Now let us lastly consider exactly what needs to be done to bring people around to Islamic banking and finance. In the first instance, we need to reinforce credibility, which has suffered in the recent past, both on account of politicians exploiting the idea for promoting their hidden agendas and unscrupulous profit seekers preying on people's gullibility and using religion as a tool. Credibility requires visible operation. Within a framework of rules, everyone can know and understand. Islamic finance has to be transparent, open to inspection by anyone and everyone. It should not be perceived to be operating in a framework of rules largely unavailable in writing, understandable only to the select few who can make sense of archaic terminology subject to varying interpretations. It should not be projected as something above the layman's scrutiny, tolerating no dissent, leaving no room for debate, immune to learning by doing, and allowing no flexibility in application. We should never lose sight of the reality that the divine part of modern Islamic finance, though crucial and central, is very small. The rest is man-made, resulting from ijtihad. More than in any other walk of life, mu'amalat, that is worldly transactions in general and finance in particular, require continuous interaction between scholars and practitioners for arriving at laws that really ensure the goals of Sharia in a particular time and place. It was so in the heyday of Islamic jurisprudence. It requires a similar environment today. But that environment does not exist at the present. We have to work for it. And I hope and pray that meetings like this one we are having today are designed to create such a movement. Thank you all.
Our next speaker is Mr. Abdul Hamid Yunus. He has his career in engineering. He's a member of the Islami Center of South California. He's also a co-founder of the Islamic Society of Greater Houston, and he's one of the pioneers of Islamic La Riba financing concepts and rules. He's going to talk to us about paper money and riba, and we're going to use the podium from now on for the speakers.
My talk today is about the biggest fraud in the history of mankind. It is about the hijacking of the global monetary system of gold standard. It is about controlling the global economy, and as such, controlling the world through the assumed power of paper money, the fiat money. It is about riba and paper money. Money in Islam is known to be gold and silver. Let us look at what is riba and money as understood in the Islamic conception. The Quran condemned and prohibited riba in one of the most terrifying threats from God to the violators. The Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, explained in few sayings the concept of riba. One saying stands out more than others to define most of the scope and kinds and the essence of riba. It says, exchange gold for gold, silver for silver, wheat for wheat, barley for barley, dates for dates, and salt for salt. Similar to similar, hand to hand. He who gives or takes more incurs riba. The giver and the taker are equal. Should the kinds of the commodities differ, then exchange as you wish, provided that the exchange is hand to hand. It seems that the hadith has defined the following items. Defined 6 kinds of commodities that were essential and commonly used and utilized in their lives. The 6 ribawi commodities. Number 2, any increase of one side over the other because of difference in the quality would be riba. And this is called riba al-fadl, or usury of excess. The Prophet emphasized this concept when a companion brought to him an excellent kind of dates from Khaybar, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked, are all the dates of Khaybar of this kind? The man said, no, but we barter 1 sa', 1 volume of this date for 2 volumes of ours. The Prophet said, do not do that, but sell your dates for money and buy these good dates with the money. Narrated by Bukhari. In another similar hadith, the Prophet said, this kind of bartering is riba. Any increase, number 3, any increase of one side over the other because of delay in the time of payment or exchange of the commodities would be riba, and this is called riba al-nasi'a, the deferred usury. The Prophet, peace be upon him, emphasized this concept when he said, indeed the riba is in al-nasi'a, in the deference of payment. That's to say, because the increase is for the delay of payment. It appears that the Prophet, peace be upon him, defined these 6 essential commodities to be reference lines, each on its own, that's to say 6 yardsticks. Each one may be used to price other commodities except its own. In other words, we cannot price gold by gold or wheat by wheat even if the exchanged qualities are different. It is obvious from the sayings of the Prophet and the rulings of jurists from different schools of thought that money in Islam is from gold or silver. Number two, money is the measure, the yardstick that prices other commodities. Also, other essential commodities, human staples such as wheat, barley, are measures and yardsticks. All measures must not be tampered with, like a standard measure. Number three, these measures and yardsticks keep their intrinsic value over the years. 1 ton of wheat keeps and maintains its intrinsic value as a human staple 100 years ago as it is now. As long as Muslims were using the gold dinar and silver dirham as their money, they continued to avoid riba in their dealings and trades. They prospered, and their economies and their golden dinar were a source of stability for centuries. David Friedman, professor in the law school and economics department at Santa Clara University, in his paper, Gold, Paper, or Is There a Better Money? He said about money made of gold, I quote, "Such international monies have sometimes maintained their weight and fineness for several centuries. Examples would be the Byzantine numisma and the Arabic dinar during the Middle Ages." End quote. Having said that very briefly about the concept of riba and money in Islam, let us have a look upon the big game of paper money. When paper money was introduced into the world of economy to replace gold and silver money, the Muslim jurists were faced with a new problem that caused a considerable amount of debate and led to different opinions. The jurist Abdullah ibn Abdurrahman Ali Bassam said in his book Taysir al-Allam fi Sharh Umdat al-Ahkam, I quote, he said, "Recently, banknotes were introduced into the market to be as money instead of gold and silver coins. They made for each coin a corresponding piece of paper that carries its name and value. The different opinions of jurists may be summarized as follows. Some jurists said it is absolutely unlawful to deal with paper money because it resembles the selling of debts or receipts of debts on the issuing bank. Some other jurists said we should deal with it as we deal in trade commodities, and therefore there is no riba in dealing in them, with increase either hand-to-hand or increase for the deferred payment. Number three, some other jurists said we should deal with it as we deal in gold and silver because the paper money is exchangeable with gold and silver on demand from the issuing bank. All these rulings were based on the premise that the paper money would be backed and covered by gold and silver and would be exchangeable with gold or silver on demand for the amount prescribed on them. Facing the realities of that time, and because of the weak situation of the Muslims in the face of other world powers, Muslims had no choice but to accept the change to the new monetary system, and as long as paper money was backed and covered with an amount of gold equivalent to the amount prescribed on them, the system continued to work fairly well. That was the start of the big game. But paper money gave the different governments all over the world the freedom to spend more than they take in. This power was exploited, and still by many governments, especially in times of war or over expenditure or corruption, by printing more money and flooding the markets with it. The purchasing power of money goes down, and the governments have to reduce the percentage of gold covering to the paper money. This happened in many countries, including the United States. Congressman Dr. Ron Paul of Texas said in his book, Gold, Peace, and Prosperity, The Birth of a New Currency, I quote, "To finance our Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress issued paper money in great quantities. Over a period of about 4.5 years, the Continental currency fell from a value of $1 paper dollar per $1 gold dollar to about 1,000 to 1. The phrase, not worth a Continental, records the fate of this paper money. In 1913, the gold cover for Federal Reserve notes was set by the 1913 law to be 40%. In 1945, the gold reserves against Federal Reserve notes was reduced 25%. Dr. Ron Paul continued to say, to continue the inflation fraud, this figure, the 25%, had to be reduced to zero. In 1965, gold reserve system requirements for Federal Reserve deposit liabilities were removed, and on August 15, 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window and refused to redeem overseas dollars for gold. The road to rampant inflation was opened to the delight of bureaucrats, politicians, international bankers, multinational corporations, and some labor leaders. The age of the managed fiat money currency was born. The British Empire was even ahead of the United States in that respect. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, 40 years before the United States. Paper money gave the opportunity to stronger industrial countries to buy their raw materials from weaker developing countries with paper money that may be devalued at any time at the will of the stronger country, which would cause the weaker ones to lose the value of their wealth. The same was played within each country, where the rich get richer by keeping their wealth in real estate and investments that can benefit from the inflation, and the poor get poorer by losing the purchasing power of their wages and salaries that never catch up with inflation. With this game, the paper money, Muslims got out of the track with the Islamic monetary system as set by the Prophet, peace be upon him. The world powers changed the track and the direction of the Muslims while they were asleep. Muslims at large, including their jurists, still debate the minute details of riba, interest, and what is halal and what is haram, while their whole Islamic system and track direction was diverted and hijacked from them. By this game of fiat paper money, the tremendous power of money was shifted from the hands of the whole world to the hands of few countries, multinational banks and corporations, which controlled the global economy. The need for military occupation of others became obsolete and was replaced by the economical occupation and control. My conclusion is, no matter what is done nowadays with good intentions of some people to abide with the Islamic monetary system and to avoid riba, Muslims are not escaping the fact that they are not in the driver's seat, but they are riders on a train that is taking them away from the pure Islamic system into an area that is polluted with riba, its dust and vapor. As the Prophet said in one of his hadiths, the time certainly will come over people when none will remain who will not devour riba. If not devour it, its vapor will overtake him. Another narrated, its dust will overtake him. This has been reported by Ahmad, Abu Dawood, and Ibn Majah. The only remedy is by going back to the Islamic monetary system of gold and silver standard, or by analogy, using other tangible commodities such as wheat, oil, corn, or other essential commodities to cover the value of paper money and give it a stable intrinsic value. Many politicians and economists, as Dr. Ron Paul, are calling for the return to the gold standard. Of course, there is a lot of opposition from governments, bankers, and multinational corporations, etc., to such a change that will deprive them from the powers they enjoy now. Muslims everywhere should support the movement of going back to the gold standard or equivalent substitute commodity. Thomas Mulligan, Times staff writer in New York, wrote an article in Los Angeles Times on September 22, 1996, titled Gold Bugs. And he introduced it by the following statement. Like a genie in a bottle, the idea waits restlessly for a change to be summoned back to life. Now, a small but ardent band of believers thinks the opportunity may finally be at hand for a return to the gold standard. It is the only shot we have had since 1980, says economic consultant Jude Wanniski, an advisor to the Republican vice presidential candidate Jack Kemp, who is one of the gold standard's strongest advocates. Wanniski and fellow gold bugs say restoring the link abolished 25 years ago between the dollar and the gold as is a tonic for all our ills in economy and social life. It will banish inflation, cut mortgage rates in half, slash the federal deficit, and spur such a surge in investment and productivity that the American family once again will be able to live on a single income. Thank you very much. May God bless you and keep you in his tender care. Salam.
Thank you, Mr. Yunus. Our next speaker is Professor Muhammad Isa. He's a professor at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's a Mellon lecturer there, and he's going to talk to us about Urf, custom, terminology, and ijtihad as applied to Islamic banking and finance.
I think I'll speak from here because
Okay,
I have to read from this.
if you prefer.
Yeah, thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I would like first to thank the people behind this opportunity to give me the honor to be with the people who know how to run the budgets very well and to finance money. And I would ask that God, Allahumma ahshurni fi zumrat al-iqtisadiyin, that God may put me on the day of judgment with the economists so I can know from them how to handle my account with God. Inshallah. Yeah. And my topic really today is about something since I'm not an economist and I would just cause myself harm if I try to use the economist terms, I'm going to talk about urf. And urf is the term used by Sharia scholars to mean custom. But urf as a word comes from a root in Arabic language that has to do with knowledge. Transmitting knowledge, acquiring knowledge, exchanging knowledge. And knowledge is a neutral term that could be for good knowledge and bad knowledge. But when the term urf or ma'ruf is used in Islam, is used only to deal with good things. So the term as urf is handled in Islam and Islamic jurisprudence to refer only to the good side of exchanging knowledge or the known thing. And the known is to be good. The term urf occurred in Quran in two places. Once in Surah Al-Mursalat, وَالْمُرْسَلَاتِ عُرْفًا, and in that particular verse, it means the clouds, and clouds brings rain, and rain for the desert dwellers is the sign of goodness. The second time is in the famous verse in Surah Al-A'raf that خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. And this was a command, a commission from God to his Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to command and commission him to command urf. And urf, as interpreted by Quranic exegetes or the mufassirun, was referring only to goodness, good things, abiding to the teachings of God. When the mufassirun dealt with that, none came close really to the term that was used by jurists to mean custom. They concentrated on the salat al-rahim as to be good to your kins, and al-afwa an man zalamak, just to forgive whoever treated you unjustly, and to give generously in charity, even to those who deprived you, who did not give you. So the term has evolved through generations to come from what is known from a religious perspective to what's known from a social perspective, and that's the custom. And what is known to be a custom is known to be a good thing, to be adopted by the community that has a sound perspective on life and feel comfortable with whatever they accept as urf. And urf became known as a custom, and known a custom of groups of communities within the boundaries of the good abiding community to the teachings of God. The role of urf as a custom in legislating and ruling the community became increasingly important as history goes. But at the early history of Islamic legislation, it did not make it to be one of the sources of legislation for any student of or researcher of fiqh or sharia. There are four established sources of legislation in Islam: the Quran as the master source, hadith, then ijma' and qiyas, regardless of some variations on recognizing one or the other, but all jurisconsults agree on Quran and hadith, and then ijma' and qiyas are somehow debatable among schools of thought. But urf did not make it as one of those. Nevertheless, urf has always been existing in legislation whether we notice it and refer to it as urf or not. Because the sunnah itself, the word sunnah, is in its literal meaning, means way of life. And way of life is what you and I accept, and the gestures that you and I in a certain community agree upon to be a greeting. And that is urf. So whatever the early community of Muslims were performing, that was known to be urf. So the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, as registered in the hadith books and in the sunnah as a source of Islam, is based actually on urf. Because you did not bring to the community a religion that tells them something that's unknown to that community or contradicts with the behavior of the community. But the religion comes to embrace what's good and to shun what's bad. And there were so many customs prevailing in Arabia before Islam. When Islam came, approved the existence of some and refused others, which are not compatible with the teachings of God. So urf has always been existing, even if we don't refer to it as urf. The question later on developed among the Sharia scholars gradually until the 16th century, when we find that there is an aggressive attempt to include urf as a source of Sharia, of legislation, especially by the Hanafi schools. And they stated in many incidents that urf is to be referred to by judges, by muftis, by any responsible religious authority to accommodate in their rulings. And the urf became very commonly used in courts, and the books that have Kutub al-Nawazil or and Fatawa are full of urf. And the advice was always to anyone who would put himself, or a scholar, or someone who would take the position of judging between people, was that the advice was to consider urf. You don't tell people from a different community what to do on basis of what you do in your own community. And that was built in the teachings of and trainings of judges and scholars of Sharia. So urf became very, my goodness, the computer didn't even start. That's the urf. So the urf in this country it is computers. But the question I really want to raise here is not urf exactly, is whose urf are we talking about? When we talk about Sharia, we talk about a body of rules, fundamental rules, general concepts. But when we talk about application, we talk about individuals, we talk about small communities. And small communities have different urfs. And when you talk about a small community with a certain urf that's different from another small community, but both are Muslim communities, which one to choose really to control both communities? Do we have to really bend our law and make it hundreds of laws because of hundreds of communities? Or we consider the general view, the general concept, and we abide by the general concept? I want to just mention an anecdote. In a newly emerging Islamic center in the United States, the women group suggested to the board of directors that they wanted to celebrate Sham al-Nasim. And the board of directors, Sham al-Nasim is a word associated with a special culture, with a special group of people coming from a special geographical place, and it is associated with celebrating spring, and the non-Muslim associated with other things, and so on and so forth. So the question was presented to the board of directors, and I was present, and I said, the word offended me at the beginning. Then I said, well, what about the concept of urf here? If people celebrate that day to gather together as families and do something good and pray and teach their kids and themselves how to be kind to others, could we just avoid the word Shem al-Nasim and call it celebrating springs in an Islamic context? Islam has so much to say about environment, has so much to say about how graceful the nature is to us as human beings, and look behind the grace of that nature. Who is the creator of that? This is a reminder day to use as a reminder of the blessings of God on us. Can we change the name? But that was the incident that represents Urf in a certain extent. When we talk about who's Urf, another community, of course, that doesn't know anything about Shem al-Nasim would look at this community as Kafir community. They are celebrating days that associated with non-Islamic incidents. And that was not a very good practice, really,
Professor
among
Isa,
people.
in case you're planning to use your computer, you only have 2 minutes left.
I'm not going to use a computer. I'm just talking from my head now. Who's Urf is the question I ask, because particularly in this country, the United States, when we have Muslim groups coming from different cultural backgrounds, and we try to implement an issue in economic, social, any cultural issue, and we want a religious opinion on that, whose Urf are we going to abide by? In one definition of Urf that was used by Imam al-Ghazali, that was referring to the behavior that's accepted by the good-natured person, and you feel comfortable with it. And my suggestion here is the person who knows the best about any community is the person that's from that community. So when we want to know the religious opinion on any issue from any community, we better look at people from that community who understand their community much better than anybody coming from outside it. And in order to do that, we have to work hard to train a mujtahid from our own community. And the sources of ijtihad, the instructions of how to create a mujtahid, or what is a mujtahid, who is a mujtahid, include in themselves thorough knowledge of the community for which he issues an ijtihad or opinion after ijtihad. Muslims in the West in general, and in America in particular, are in a dire need to have their own mujtahid, to train and invest. And financial institutions have the responsibility of allocating funds to create their own mujtahids and train them, teach them, expose them to the sources of Islam. They know Islam very well, and they have to be educated also in the social sciences and the humanity issues that pertaining to their own communities as well. And this is the angle that I really take as an application of when we talk about Urf, definitions of Islamic legislative issues, we talk about financial issues, we talk about allocating funds to establish our own think tank of Islamic theology in our own communities, so that we have people who know us, who know ourselves very well and know Islam very well, and when they come up with an opinion, it's not a borrowed opinion from another Urf of another community. And I stop here. I did not read my paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Professor Mahmoud Al-Gamal, who is being honored tonight. He's Professor of Economics and Statistics at Rice University, Houston, Texas. And he's the chair professor for the Islamic economics. He's going to talk to us about the revival of the roots of Islamic economics and finance.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I will try to cut my talk short to stick within the 15 minutes. And so 15 minutes from now, Shannon? Okay. I would like to begin by showing you a diagram that somewhat summarizes the mental image most people have of the field of Islamic economics and finance, and then I'll try to dissect it and show you that I believe our understanding is quite wrong. The idea most of us will have is that, of course, we have the Quran and the Sunnah, those are the nusus, the canonical Islamic texts, and then there are the ijma' and qiyas, which are sort of at the second tier, and then all sorts of other methods that jurists may use, which may be reclassified as forms of qiyas or reasoning by analogy, and then this gives us a somewhat fixed body of knowledge that we call Islamic jurisprudence that is somewhat certain. And then from that, the assumption is that that body of Islamic jurisprudence has determined once and for all that basically everything that is quote-unquote Western finance is un-Islamic, by definition almost, and that somehow there is an ideal Islamic form that may even be derived directly from those canonical texts, or at least from very strong juristic inference, that determine that those profit and loss sharing types of contracts, forms of silent partnership or full partnership, are the ideal Islamic financial contracts to use, but that jurists, for some reasons of their own, have decided to permit some short-term alternatives like credit sale financing, called murabaha, or bay' b'thaman ajil, etc., lease financing, and so on. So that's the image most of us have in this industry when we look at it, and that's certainly the image you'll get, I'm sure, by listening to various speakers today and other conferences. But I would like to claim, actually, that the writings of Islamic economists have played a crucial role in deciding what goes in those boxes down there. That those are somewhat novel interpretations, rereadings of the text, so to speak, based on economic thought, and I dare say that a lot of it is not particularly good economics. The economic thought may come from jurists, or it may come from economists who classify themselves as Islamic economists, but it basically read into jurisprudence what's not really there. For instance, mudaraba, if you read writings in Islamic economics, you'd think that somehow you'd open books of hadith and find some hadith on mudaraba, or find some ayah in the Quran about mudaraba, because everybody's talking about it. But the reality is, as Ibn Taymiyyah said, for instance, that it's one of those contracts that has absolutely no basis in those canonical texts. And when you see people trying to refer to some verse in the Quran, وَضْرِبُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ or something, and that phrase doesn't say anything about mudaraba as the contract that you have now. It's really just trying to play linguistic games. So I would argue that actually all of current Islamic finance and the understandings people have that profit and loss sharing is the essence of Islamic finance, and that everything that's built on credit or debt is un-Islamic in some way and maybe tolerated only as a short-term solution, that's a fiction that was created in the middle of the last century, and it's a fiction that has no basis in Islamic jurisprudence, certainly in the Islamic canonical texts. So what did the historical Islamic economics do, either written by economists or by jurists? The first thing they did was to determine that the illah, or the instigating factors in certain prohibitions that are there. Obviously, the prohibition of riba is in the Quran as well as in the hadith. The prohibition of gharar is in the hadith, and there are some references people may infer from the Quran. But certainly the instigating factors in what makes certain contracts ribawi, or forbidden based on riba, or forbidden based on gharar, both the instigating factor from a juristic point of view as well as the hikmah, or the wisdom that can be understood from a social point of view, were recolored by those writings of Islamic economists. And they influenced jurists, convincing them that those were indeed the instigating factors and objectives behind those prohibitions. And I'm going to give you examples of this in a little while. So for instance, in the case of riba, and I've talked about this in previous conferences, I don't know how many people here have attended my previous talks, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but I'll give you a reference. For instance, there is the myth that, and the late Dr. Ahmed al-Najjar, for instance, in many of his writings said this, if the rate of return is fixed and the time period is fixed, that is interest, that is riba. But you look at those permitted contracts, like a lease to purchase or a credit sale with deferment, etc., they all have fixed rates of return, they all have fixed terms. It is not the forbidden riba. So that's clearly wrong. And if we go back to writings of Taqiyuddin al-Subki in Takmilat al-Majmu' al-Nawawi, you'll find that this was something people had mentioned in previous centuries, was thoroughly debunked, but it got revived in the 20th century and somehow stuck. Another one is return without risk. You say you can't deserve return without risk. Anybody who's had a first course in economics or finance recognizes that there is credit risk. When you lend somebody with interest, it doesn't mean you're not taking a risk. They may be bankrupt, they may not have assets to pay you back. There is risk. So that's not the explanation. The prohibition is still there. I'm not saying we're going to wipe it out. I'm just saying the explanations that were given and the consequences of those explanations are not really well grounded in Islamic thought at all. Exploitation of the poor. Of course, exploitation of the poor is still possible. Even if you don't use riba in the forms that jurists recognize, you can still exploit the poor. Again, Taqiyuddin Subki gives the example. You can always trade in camels. Give somebody a camel today, get 5 in a year. It's a 400% interest rate. But it's not forbidden because camels are not among the ribawi goods, and you cannot get there by any reasonable form of reasoning by analogy. Just some self promotion. I tried to write some papers to to analyze the juristic texts as well as provide some economic rationale to try to explain what those prohibitions were. And in my humble opinion today, I think that the prohibition of riba is really about two things. One is collateralization, sort of linking financial and real activities. And the other is the concept of marking to market, that the rate of return on money has to be linked to the particular economic activity that's being financed, and that's why you have different rates of return. But that, of course, is done also in conventional finance. It's just that Islam has built-in financial regulations in this form. And the prohibition of gharar is sort of trying to avoid some types of individual irrationality when dealing with risk, that people treat risk ex post and ex ante in two different ways. But anyway, I won't bore you with the technical details. I presented them elsewhere, and you can read the papers if you're interested. But the worst thing that I believe historical Islamic economics did was to convince jurists that there is a viable, radical Islamic alternative. That today you can establish a full economic system that looks nothing like Western financial and economic systems, but that is viable. And jurists, not being experts in economics, read those articles and books and were convinced that somehow, yes, that system does exist. And so you'll see again from the opinions as I go through a case study that jurists are thoroughly convinced that those writings in Islamic economics are, number one, good economics, and that they prove that there is a radical and viable alternative. And then they insist that that's the alternative we have to use. So the case study I want to give is something that for research I'm doing now. I'm not going to bore you again with the technical details either on the jurisprudence side or on the economic side, but I'll show you examples of fatwas. And I've chosen only fatwas that are available on the internet, so you can go on your own and look them up, that show how muddled jurist thinking is and how the writings in Islamic economics actually, I believe, were the perpetrators of this confusion. The solicited fatwas, let me just mention very quickly, I don't have much time. Bonds have, it's like light, has different, you can look at it as particles or waves. Money can be looked at, bonds can be looked at as money, or they can be looked at as debt. They sort of live two lives, especially in the world of fiat money, and I'll get back to the issue that was mentioned earlier about fiat money versus commodity money. But certainly in the world of fiat money, there isn't a whole lot of difference between cash and bonds. I mean, think about it. You can either carry, if you're going to hold $10,000 for a year, you can either put it, in a $100 pack of $100 bills signed by the Secretary of the Treasury, or you can hold it in a Treasury bill held by a Secretary of the Treasury that will pay $10,000 at that same point. Two debts on the same entity signed by the same person paying the same amount in a year. The only difference is about liquidity. Now, there are lots of things that are wrong with bonds. It's a form of taxation of the poor and so on, because the poor usually can't sort of... What money is an indefinite debt that the government basically gets to use any way it wants, whereas the bond at least is linked to that money. But I'm not going to get into the details. The important thing is that you can see from the solicited fatwas, just by reading the fatwas, you can guess what people ask them about. And you can see that the governments and the banks are very dissatisfied with the way jurists are thinking, and they're trying to find all sorts of tricks. And that's how I'm going to conclude that that's the big disease in Islamic finance today. So the first thing is jurists always keep using the term money is not a commodity. Money is not a commodity. But then, as we heard earlier, the consensus opinion now is that it has the same rules as gold and silver, which are commodity monies. By the way, all 6 commodities mentioned in the hadith of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri that was mentioned earlier were used as commodity monies at some point in time or another. Dates, salt, and so on, they were all used as commodity monies at different times. So it's not only gold and silver that can be used as numerators and were used historically as numerators. Especially, for instance, in North Africa, salt was a very popular money because they have those salt pillars that you can cut into nice coins that can last for a long time. Anyway, so they simultaneously say it's not a commodity while they're commodifying it. And then when they're asked about trading different currencies for one another, they say, no, they're different genera. It's okay. You're not trading debts for debts because a US dollar and a Kuwaiti dinar are sort of like trading gold for silver. You still have to obey the rules of sarf, but it's okay. So they treat them like different genera, but at the same time, a single government is not allowed to issue 2 different currencies and then determine the rate of exchange any way they want. That's how the Medicis basically got around the rules of prohibition of riba in the 15th century. So simultaneously, again, they allow different countries somehow to issue different genera. It's as if they can create different metals that are now analogous to gold, but one country cannot do it. Of course, if the country gets independent, issues 2 currencies, somehow magically that same money became 2 different genera, as if commodities are arising out of thin air. The other thing they do is whenever they don't understand something, they go back to Sadd al-Dhara'i. They say, we're not sure how you're going to use this. You're a banker. We're suspicious. We think you want to do riba under another name, and you just want us to approve it. So if we don't understand it, we say it's forbidden. So here are a few interesting fatwas. You can tell what's going on. Kuwait Finance House asks, well, can we redeem bonds in a different currency? Of course, the Sharia board is known to be one of the strictest. They say, no, you can't do that. Here's a place where clearly the jurists are strongly influenced by what Islamic economists are doing. Rajhi asks, well, how can we participate in paying the fiscal deficit of the Saudi government? And they say, oh, there are all these mudaraba bonds and so on based on profit and loss sharing. Those are things that are created in the Islamic Development Bank, not particularly good economics again. It's just basically populist writing for people who want to believe what's written ex ante. But it doesn't stand the scrutiny of any careful economic analysis. They got away with one. They asked them, well, is platinum the same as gold and silver, or is it different? They told them, no, it's different. So there you go. You can have 2 currencies, one based on gold standard and the other based on a platinum standard. You can do anything you want with those. So again, you can go and check all these fatwas if you want. Here's another fatwa that's very interesting. I told you that bonds can be viewed both as money and as debt. They decided that debt is indeed a loan. So that's one of the problems. I said that they try to always squeeze everything into those same chapters that they have in their books of jurisprudence. So they decided that, and I'll just give you a whole slew of those. So positive coupon bonds are loans. 0 coupon bonds are loans. Those are like treasury bills. Bonds that pay unpromised prices, like the Malaysian government investment certificates or the Egyptian Ahli Bank Type C investment certificates and so on. They said, no, they are loans that benefit, still forbidden. And then again, they refer to that alternative, that they're now convinced by those writings in so-called Islamic economics that this is a viable and fundamentally different alternative. We can have these mudaraba bonds that will do the job. Of course, they won't, and I won't bore you with why you can't build a fiscal policy with that or a monetary policy. In one of the most insightful of the contemporary jurists, rahimahullah, Sheikh Mustafa Zarqa, shortly before passing away, was asked by the Jordanian government about issuing treasury bills. And again, the language is very interesting because he thought about it for a long time and said, it cannot really be classified as anything other than a loan. So again, maybe the economics was not presented to him in the best possible way, but at least he recognizes that there are different ways of thinking about it. And then he goes through saying all other loans or other bonds have the same loan status, and then, as with all other contemporary jurists, attacks the Imam al-Azhar, Sheikh al-Azhar, as to the point of raising doubts about his knowledge and faith because he disagreed. He just he reached a different juristic opinion based on the same evidence. And again, recommends Musharaka and Mudaraba, and you can see referring to Dr. Omar Chapra's book on just monetary system. Again, as if somehow that's a text that from which you can infer juristic rulings. So in my opinion, what has happened now is that economists have borrowed the worst traits of jurists, and jurists have borrowed the worst traits of economists. So jurists have adopted the worst traits of economists. Economists, when asked about something, they like to give a quick answer, knowing that they can always change the answer later. Nobody takes them too seriously. Everybody knows that every economist has two hands. He says on the one hand and on the other hand. The analysis we heard earlier from Brother Yunus was very similar to the vision of what fiat money is in Goethe's Faust. I advise you to read it. That this was a diabolical plot to convince the emperor that he can issue paper money on gold that's not even been extracted from the land, and how that allowed the emperor all sorts of luxuries and so on. But I won't bore you with the details. The other thing is, again, seeking temporary solutions to permanent problems. When the government calls you and Council of Economic Affairs calls you and says, we need to solve this problem, you know it's a permanent problem, but you have to give them a solution right away. And jurists, unfortunately, have been doing this. They are asked, what do we do? And they say, here's what you do, mudaraba bond, whatever. They don't even think about what are the economic consequences, does it do the job? On the other hand, economists have adopted the worst traits of jurists. While jurists often, you read that they say that what really matters are the meanings, العبرة بالمعاني وليس بالألفاظ, that it's not the name of the contract that matters, it's the substance. In reality, what the jurists today are doing is precisely looking only at the names. They split hairs over whether or not you can call something murabaha, rather than just look at it and say, does it contain riba or not? That's what I really care about. Let's call it contract number 1. It doesn't matter what you call it. But unfortunately, economists got tangled in this. So they have all these different constructions that they've been developing, very much to cater to those jurists who are doing the worst things economists do. And the other thing is absolutism in defining what's Islamic. Money is a new phenomenon. And we heard earlier Mr. Yunus talk about paper money. I'll have to finish 1 minute. Money, as we know it today, was really invented in the 20th century. And people talk about paper money as if that's what's new. As of 1999, only 8% of the total volume of dollars in the world actually existed in physical form, paper or otherwise, paper, coin, anything. The rest are just blips on somebody's computer chip. And to try to decide that we know for sure what is Islamic and what's not Islamic in that completely new context so quickly is just presumptuous. Let me skip all of this and say what. How about this one? 2 more slides. I'll go very quickly. So what I'm wondering is whether or not we can recognize that everything that's not in a text is probable. All human knowledge is probable, even if the best jurists of the century all agree on it, based on faulty economic analysis by economists and by the jurists themselves. We have to recognize this is probable, it is not certain. We do not know that something is Islamic and something is not Islamic unless there is a clear and unequivocal text about it. We have to overcome the outdated suspicion of everything that's Western. We have to overcome the urgency of always saying, yes, it's Islamic, or no, it's Islamic. It's not Islamic. I wish jurists would say, I don't know, every now and then, but they don't. And I would really like that we stop writing apologetic economics papers. And I do that. That's what I do when I put on my hat of Islamic economics. A good economist can write a model to justify anything. I can justify something and justify its opposite because I know how to play with the math. And playing this apologetic game doesn't fool anybody. I think we need to get beyond that and really get to the heart of the thing. What is the Sharia really about, and what really is Islamic and not Islamic? And let me jump to the last slide and say if jurists were to adopt the best traits of economists instead of the worst, and economists were to adopt the best traits of jurists instead of the worst, then jurists will become skeptical about their own writings, even if it's in Ibn Taymiyyah or if it's in Nawawi or if it's Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya or whoever it is. This was the thinking of somebody during that time. We have better economic research today, and so whatever part of that decision was based on economic reasoning can easily be abrogated because it's human reasoning and replaced by the state-of-the-art knowledge, just like we do in medicine and other areas. You can see the early opinions on say, transferring a kidney and the more modern opinions as jurists got to consult more economists. So that's the second, more physicians. The second point is that when economists have a problem, when Malaysia or any country, or Indonesia, any country has a problem, what they do is they consult the best in the business. They get the best economists out there to come and try to solve their problem. They say, this is our problem, this is what we want to do. according to the state of the art. Unfortunately, we're still trapped in suspecting everything that's Western, and therefore we have, quite honestly, and I'm in that category, mediocre economists who are going out there and trying to create a system, and we're not using the best talents in the world. So if jurists will listen to the best economists instead of just listening to people who share their rhetoric, their name, and their ideology, that will help them a lot in understanding the real economic situation. And then if economists were to adopt the best traits of jurists, they would actually follow what jurists write down rather than what they say, and look at the functions rather than the forms. Stop all this stuff about ijara, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's nonsense. Let's just look at what is really the essence of what's forbidden, and let's see if you can build an economic environment where you don't use what's forbidden and use what is allowed. And the other thing is that jurists always, at least again in writing, try to look at the overall social and economic costs and benefits rather than look very narrowly. And Professor Siddiqui spoke about this earlier. People tend to write to champion a certain political ideological case, and they just you write an apologetic piece in order to say, oh yeah, sure, I can do this with an ijara bond or whatever. But I think we really need to sit down and think deeply about the issue. And if we don't publish anything about this for 100 years, so much the better. And if we don't have another Islamic bank for another 100 years, I think so much the better. Let's, when we do it right. Thank you very much.
So far what we have listened, all these lectures and talks, and we learned that the whole world economy is built on the foundation of non-Islamic rules. And there is riba and a lot of other things. So now we are trying to raise the pillars of Islamic rules on the very same foundation. So this, I think it is next to impossible. So I want you to emphasize that either we should have to make a new foundation, or we have to use some other approach. We cannot mix two things, Islamic and non-Islamic. Thank you.
Professor Mahmoud?
I think what I tried to do is actually to say that that's not certain, that the economic system is built on un-Islamic foundations, because I don't think it is. But there are certainly contracts that are being used that are clearly and unequivocally ribawi. I don't think that the economy is built on them, but I think that there are certain financial transactions that exist now that are forbidden, and there are other transactions that are forbidden, just like there is pork being sold in the supermarket where you go to buy your vegetables. It doesn't mean that the whole supermarket is built on pork. It just means that that's one of the things that's being sold there. Now, mixing Islamic and un-Islamic things, the example of the Prophet ﷺ is precisely gradual development of an Islamic society, and how to develop it is a dynamic process that depends on what succeeded and what didn't succeed and so on. The idea that somebody can sit in his armchair and write a book that says how to build a society from scratch is just ludicrous. Every experiment in human history at social engineering has failed miserably. Every such experiment has failed miserably. We're humans, unless somebody, the Prophet ﷺ was inspired. It wasn't human reasoning that built that society that he was in. We are humans, and no amount of research is going to give us exactly a perfect system that we can just build from scratch. So we have to start by what's there and see what is forbidden and purify our own transactions and try to build the best society we can within our means, and then hopefully progress towards something where we feel that there's nothing un-Islamic in our society. But this idea of building something from scratch is just not only impractical, it's just not even a reasonable thing to think ex ante.
I have a question for Mr. Yunus. I'd like to hear a comment on the third world debt, because it's increasing at massive amounts, and yet the resources that have been extricated from the third world to pay for this debt seem to have been more valuable than this debt. So where are we when it comes to trying to get this third world debt eradicated under the present system. I don't see how it is possible, and I would like your comments on this.
I think that's why I call the whole system of paper money is a big fraud. It is actually to suck the money of the world into few hands and few banks and few institutions. So it was done for that purpose. So the poorer has to get poorer and the rich has to get richer. That's the whole idea. So that's the reality of the situation. In order to change that, that would be another thing. I don't think you can change it because assume the people who took that power of money, they will fight to death. They will make a world war that kill everyone else to keep that power. Imagine that they have been hijacking that big power and controlling the world now, somehow, and you want to take it from them. On what basis? There are some thinking and some people are thinking of solution. The people who has the natural wealth, for example, they can say, we will not sell our raw materials except by money backed by such and such commodities, like gold. And you will see at that point a big shift in the world powers. World powers will change naturally when a group of countries with lots of natural resources will insist on having their products sold only for backed money. In this case, you will find the change of powers in the world. Other than that, it will stay in the status quo like this.
I have a question to Professor Mahmoud Jamal. Throughout the lecture, Professor, you have been emphasizing economics as a divine gift to this world, as a divine subject or a prophecy. This is a man-made subject, learned from implementation and our practical experiences. And you are challenging the Islamic jurists. From your lecture, there is a visibility that you are so burned up from the fiqh and from jurists that you want them to apologize all the time. The fact is that those fiqh and those jurisdiction is based on our faith, the Quran, and the life of Prophet Muhammad. That's a practical demonstration for the entire universe. And that is what I call knowledge. Every action of the Prophet itself carried knowledge and weight. And that's where all the Islamic jurists, they gather together and they get this information. I don't see any connectivity of your economic views to riba or to the finances of Islam and its prohibitions. Can you comment, please?
Professor Mahmoud.
Comment on some of the points. Obviously, I did not. I think you must have been facetious when you said that I claimed that economics was divine. All I tried to say was that fiqh was not divine. Fiqh is the work of humans who make mistakes and who are corrected over time. It's always been the history of fiqh. They do not receive revelation. About the relationship, what I try to do is to show that the fuqaha can be either coherent or incoherent in their understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah. And since I'm not a faqih, I do not try to give the alternative coherent view of fiqh, but I can certainly point to the economic incoherence. It's just like if you're a third grader and you see a faqih that says 4 + 4 = 9, you can correct him and say, no, that's inconsistent. So that's all I'm saying. I mean, to say something about what Brother Yunus was saying earlier, I think at least I have to credit the view of those who want commodity-backed monies and then applying the rules of riba as they exist in traditional jurisprudence with being coherent. It's a coherent worldview. You say, we don't know how to deal with the current money, and therefore we want to go back to something familiar so that the jurists who only know what's in those books can give us the answers. Because certainly in the world we live in now, which they have accepted, they are giving incoherent answers. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين. The question is again to Professor Mahmoud. Should we follow the path that you recommend? How should we handle issues, Islamic issues in terms of haram and halal, finance issues in the meantime? Because it might take years and years before Muslims reach an agreement and rethink the issues that you brought up.
So that addresses the temporary solutions. I agree with the temporary solutions. I mean, I spoke before that many of the formulas are already there for the daily life issues. So we don't have to, do anything more. We already have the murabaha and the ijara, muntahi bit-tamlik, and musharaka mutanaqisa and all that, and that's fine. That's just like going to the supermarket. You see the pork and you say, that's what's forbidden, and next to it is the salad or the halal meat or the whatever, and that's what's not forbidden. You buy that and you leave. That's at the retail level. But we're talking about much more important things sometimes, like a full Islamizing economy. Pakistan is literally being driven into the dust with an unreasonable view about how they can build an economic system. Every now and then, the actions actually don't match the rhetoric. But those are the issues I was discussing. I wasn't discussing the retail level because I think those are solved problems. We don't need anything more than what we already have. You want to finance a car, you want to finance a home, you want to finance equipment, and so on. The menu is there. There are multiple providers of that, and we don't need anything more than that. They fulfill that job, I think. The question is, where do we go from here? What's the next step?
Unfortunately, we don't have more time for comments and questions. But let me just make one comment from hearing the Islamic jurisprudence talk in the last few years, is that the الأصل في التعاملات هو الحل. The basis of transactions is permissibility, unless it contradicts with a text from the Quran and Sunnah. So I guess maybe that can help explain what Dr. Al-Gamal was trying to say. With that, I think we come to the end of this session. I think we had a very superb performance by all the panelists. And thank you very much for being good listeners, and excuses for not taking all the questions.